The Council's vanguard dropped out of transit fold 11 kilometers above the Atlantic seaboard at 4:17 hours, and the first thing their deep scan array told them was that the city below them was impossible. I was standing at the observation rail of Coastal Oversight Station Aurenne when the transit signature hit the boards. I had been on watch for 6 hours already. I had a cold cup of something that was supposed to be coffee, and I had been waiting, in the particular way that people in this line of work learn to wait, not with dread, not with impatience, but with the flat patience of someone who has read every page of the record and knows precisely what the next chapter is going to say. The technician at Scan 3, a young woman named Calder, looked at her board, looked at it again, and said, very quietly, "Station, I have 17 transit signatures. Grid reference November 7, altitude 11.3 kilometers. Reading mass displacement consistent with capital class enforcement vessels." I set my cup down, tagged them, and opened the condemnation registry. She pulled the registry without asking why. That was how we trained them. When the big board lights up after 45,000 years of silence, you don't ask why, you go to the record first and the radio second. The condemnation registry was not a short document. It was, in fact, the single most detailed archive the city of Aurenne kept, more detailed than our engineering schematics, more detailed than our population census, more detailed than the operational manuals for the coastal guns, the orbital lattice, or the seawall array. The registry began with a date 45,011 years ago. It ended with a formal counter-notice filed 32 years later, when the last survivor of the city's original quarantine had scratched her name onto a steel plate and told the record that she was still here, that she remembered who had put them here, and that she intended to be ready when they came back. The registry ran to 11 volumes after that first entry, 11 volumes of names. I want you to understand that number before I go any further. 11 volumes, 45,000 years of names, every person who had ever been born inside Aurenne's boundaries since the condemnation, every person who had passed through, every person who had worked the guns, crewed the lattice, tended the seawall, or simply lived under the sky of a city that the Galactic Enforcement Council had written off as a dead zone 45 millennia ago and never bothered to check again. The registry was not a memorial, it was not a monument, it was a legal instrument. It was our counterfiling, our formal response to the condemnation order, grown over 45,000 years from that first scratched steel plate into 11 bound volumes of human lives. Every name in it was a rebuttal. Every name said, "We are here, we remember, we are counting." And now the people who had issued the condemnation order were 11 kilometers above us, running scans that were telling them something had gone wrong with their assumptions. I touched the command panel on my rail and opened the house channel. "All stations, this is Aurenne Coastal Oversight. The registry event is active. I say again, registry event active. All posts to standing alert. Do not fire. Do not paint targets. Let them look. Let them look." That was the doctrine. Not because we were afraid of them. We had not been afraid of anything enforcement class in 30,000 years, and we were considerably less afraid now than we had been then. The doctrine was, let them look first. Let their instruments do the work. Let them read the sky above Aurenne and understand what they came back to before we said a single word, because the words would land harder after the instruments had already told them the truth. Because there is a specific kind of silence that falls over a commander whose certainties have just been publicly, empirically destroyed. And we had learned, from 45,000 years of preparing for this exact morning, that it was better to speak into that silence than to fill it preemptively. So I stood at the rail and watched the city and waited for their sensors to catch up with our reality. Aurenne was not, by the standards of the 32nd millennium, a large city. It was a coastal city, a working city, a defense city. Its population ran to about 9 million permanent residents. Its skyline was not the tallest in the hemisphere. It did not have the longest orbital tether or the deepest aquifer network or the most powerful individual weapons platform. What it had was the seawall array. The seawall array ran 214 kilometers along the coastline north and south of the original city center. It had been begun 11 years after the condemnation, not in response to any immediate threat, but because the surviving founders of post-condemnation Iran had decided, with a clarity of purpose that I still find remarkable when I read their original engineering notes, that the most useful thing they could do with the time they had been given was to build something that would make the point for them when the council eventually came back. The array had been 214 kilometers when it was finished, and it had never stopped growing. It had been rebuilt 11 times, each iteration larger and more capable than the last, and the current version, the 12th, sat on foundations that the original builders would not have recognized as foundations at all. The original seawall had been a defense structure. The 12th seawall was a planetary statement. Its upper tier cleared 90 meters above sea level. Its weapon bays ran the full length of the coastline, one every 400 meters, each bay housing a pair of naval-grade energy cannons with targeting solutions maintained by the same processing network that ran the orbital lattice. Its sensor suites were so sensitive that they had been tracking the Council's transit fold buildup for 6 hours before the fold actually opened, which was how I had known to be at the rail with my cold cup of not-quite coffee at 4:17 instead of in my bunk. The seawall was what their deep scan was seeing first. I knew this because I had read the Council's operational protocols. They were in the Registry, Volume 3, recovered from a salvaged enforcement courier that had drifted into our boundary zone 11,000 years ago and been politely disassembled for its data cores, and their first pass scan would be surface infrastructure. And surface infrastructure in a REN meant the seawall. I watched Calder's board from across the room. I could not read the individual readings from that distance, but I could read her posture. She was very still in the way that junior technicians go still when they are trying to decide whether to report something or check it twice first. "Report it," I said. She looked up. "Sir. Whatever you're second-guessing, report it." She turned back to her board. "I'm reading active targeting returns on the lead council vessel, not from us, from the lattice." A pause. "The orbital lattice has been painting them since before I called the transit signatures." "Yes. The lattice is automated." "It's autonomous," I said. "There's a difference. It paints anything that transits over a REN without a registered transit code. The Council's vessels are not in our registry. Because they've never been here before. Because they haven't been here in 45,000 years. Their transit codes from 45,000 years ago are in the old registry. They have not been updated." I picked up my cup again. "The lattice is doing its job." There was a silence across the watch floor. I could hear the building hum of the array, not its weapons, just its sensors, cycling through their active passes, and the distant, lower register of the city itself. 9 million people going about the early hours of a morning that most of them did not yet know was a registry event morning. The transit fold had opened at 4:17. It was now 4:31. In about 20 minutes, the city's civil alert network would push a notification to every registered device in a REN. The notification would say, in language that had been drafted and refined and legally reviewed across 6 different generations of civil emergency planners, "The registry event has been triggered. Please remain in your current location. The Coastal Authority has the situation under its jurisdiction. Iran remembers." That last sentence, "Iran remembers," had been in the civil alert template since the original founders wrote it. It had never been sent before today. Every generation of emergency planners since had reviewed it, read those 2 words, and left them exactly where they were. "Iran remembers." We did. At 4:33. Calder's board registered a second pass scan from the formation, deeper, longer. the specific scan profile that Volume 3 called an anomaly investigation sweep. They had gotten unexpected readings on their first pass and had gone back for a closer look. I could picture the sensor operators aboard the Sovereign Reach working through their checklists, running calibration checks on their instruments, doing what sensor operators do when the instruments insist on telling them something that does not match the mission profile. The mission profile said, uninhabited zone, no significant construction, standard confirmation sweep, estimated duration 40 minutes. The second pass scan ran for 11 minutes. When it finished, Calder read out the lattice's response signature. The formation had altered its internal geometry, the vessels spreading slightly apart in the specific pattern that Volume 3 identified as defensive dispersal. A formation shift consistent with a crew that had just received scan data suggesting a threat level higher than anticipated. They were getting the picture. At 4:36, something unexpected happened. A single transmission came in on a secondary enforcement frequency, not the standard hailing channel, but a tactical coordination frequency that Volume 3 listed as being used for internal formation communications. It was an open broadcast, not a directed signal, which meant it had been sent without the sender ensuring it was restricted to internal recipients. The sender may not have realized we would be monitoring that frequency. We had been monitoring it for 22,000 years. The transmission was brief, and in a register I did not immediately recognize from Volume 3. Not the formal old protocol, but something closer to working deck vernacular. The register of a junior crew member speaking in a hurry to someone nearby, rather than composing an official communication. It said, in a translation I will render as closely as I can while preserving the register. Principle: the infrastructure grid is live across the full coastal zone, and we cannot get a clean transit approach vector. The lattice has us plotted in 17 separate intercept solutions, and they were all established before we completed fold emergence. I read that back to myself twice. The lattice had begun acquiring targeting solutions on the Council's formation before the transit fold had fully opened. Before the formation was even physically present in our airspace, the lattice's predictive intercept system had already been working on them. That was not a feature we had installed. That was a feature that had been added to the lattice 14,000 years ago by an engineering team whose notes cited, as their justification, a doctrine memo that went back to the founding of the Coastal Authority. Do not wait to be seen. Be ready before they arrive. The lattice had been ready before they arrived. Calder was looking at me. She had heard the transmission on her board at the same moment I had. Her expression said the same thing mine presumably did, which was, we knew the lattice was good. We did not know it was that good. I said quietly, to no one in particular, 14,000 years of upgrades. She said, yes, sir. I said, make sure that transmission gets logged in Volume 11. She said, already done. We were a well-trained watch. At 4:38, the Council's lead vessel broke from the formation and descended toward the lower atmosphere, running what their protocols designated a close assessment pass. A slower, lower-altitude scan intended to supplement the deep scan data with direct visual and atmospheric reading. This was, according to Volume 3, standard enforcement doctrine when the first pass scan returned data that contradicted the mission profile. The mission profile, as we understood it from the condemnation order itself, reproduced in full in Volume 1, page 1, under the heading, "The document we are responding to," was as follows. The city zone designated a REN, coastal sector, Earth Origin World, had been placed under Galactic Council condemnation status 45,011 years ago, following a determination that the indigenous population of the world had committed a Category 7 violation of Galactic Health and Containment Protocol. The condemnation classified the zone as a permanently uninhabited restricted area. The condemnation order stated, And I am reading this from memory because I have read it enough times that it lives in my head like a piece of old music, that the zone would remain under restricted status until such time as the council determined that the conditions warranting condemnation had been permanently resolved. The conditions warranting condemnation had been, as near as anyone in Aren had ever been able to determine, that we existed, that this city on this coast had refused to scatter, that the people the council had decided were a manageable loss had declined to be managed and declined to be lost, and had instead, over 45,000 years, built a wall 214 kilometers long and started keeping records. That was our violation in the end. We were still here. The close assessment vessel crossed over the northern end of the seawall at approximately 900 meters altitude. I know this because Calder had it on visual tracking by then, and I watched the feed on the secondary board, a sleek, dark ship, heavy enforcement lines, the council's registry glyph visible on its forward hull. It was moving slowly, the way a vessel moves when its crew is not looking at where they are going but at what is below them. Below them at that point was the northern terminus of the seawall array, which included weapons batteries 17 through 24, the northern sensor head cluster, and the memorial installation that had been built at the array's northern end 400 years ago. The memorial was not a dramatic structure. It was a low building, about 40 meters long, faced in dark stone, with its roof open to the sky. The building contained the original 11 volumes of the registry, not copies. The originals. The physical documents, under climate preservation, in a chamber that had been maintained continuously for over 30,000 years. The building's exterior carried a single carved inscription on its longest face, facing seaward, and the inscription was the counternotice from the founding survivor, the woman who had scratched her name on a steel plate 45,000 years ago and told the record she was still here. The inscription read, "We have not gone, we will not go. Come and read our names." The close assessment vessel slowed when it crossed the northern terminus. I know it slowed because Calder's tracking feed showed it holding position for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, an eternity in a close assessment pass, directly above the memorial installation. And then it continued south along the array, moving at roughly half its previous speed. I thought about the crew of that vessel. I thought about whoever was looking at the screens showing them the seawall, its scale, its weapon bays, its continuous, unbroken line running south as far as they could see. I thought about the moment when they would have realized that the city below them was not a ruin, was not a remnant, was not a scraggly, desperate remnant population clinging to the edge of a condemned zone. I thought about the specific quality of that realization. The difference between being told a thing and seeing a thing with your own instruments when you came to do a confirmation pass on a dead zone. They had come to confirm a condemnation, 45,000 years old. They were looking at 214 kilometers of operational weapons infrastructure. I finished my coffee. It had gone fully cold and tasted like metal, and I drank it anyway, because it was there and because some rituals, however small, help you keep your composure on the morning you have been preparing for your entire career. The close assessment vessel completed its southern pass and came back north along the array at the same low speed. It was running the full length a second time, which was not in the Volume 3 close assessment protocol. This was additional. Something had prompted a second look. I had a reasonable idea what. The lattice lock. The lattice was painted on every vessel in the formation, and the close assessment vessel would have its own board showing it a steady targeting lock from the ground that had not wavered since the moment of transit fold emergence. The weapons bays below the vessel were dark. We had followed the doctrine. We had not activated weapons, but the targeting sensors were live. And there is something very clarifying about flying low over 214 kilometers of weapons infrastructure, while watching a steady lock indicator tell you that all of it knows exactly where you are. I waited. At 5:01, the lead vessel, the one that had held formation at altitude while the close assessment vessel made its pass, broadcast on the Galactic Enforcement Standard hailing frequency. The broadcast was in Old Protocol Formal Register, which is a specific linguistic mode the Council uses for official enforcement communications. Very precise, very structured, no idiom, no ambiguity. Our registry had a full grammar and vocabulary index for Old Protocol Formal Register in Volume 3, Chapter 9, alongside a set of prepared response templates that had been drafted and reviewed and updated by every generation of Aren's coastal authority going back 22,000 years. I was current on all of them. The broadcast said, "This is Galactic Enforcement Vessel Sovereign Reach, acting under authority of the Council standing Condemnation Order Reference Number 774-9, issued 45,011 standard years ago. We are conducting a mandatory assessment of the restricted zone designated Aren Coastal Earth. We require the immediate cessation of all active sensor emissions and weapons system targeting locks within the restricted zone. Non-compliance will be treated as an escalatory act under Council Enforcement Protocol." I let the broadcast sit for 30 seconds before I responded, not because I needed the time, because I wanted them to have 30 seconds of silence in which to sit with the fact that their sensors had just told them we had a target lock on them from the orbital lattice, which I had specifically not ordered to stand down, because standing down the lattice for a vessel that did not have a registered transit code would have been a violation of our own operational protocol, and I did not intend to begin this conversation by violating our own operational protocol. I keyed the response channel and spoke in Old Protocol Formal Register. I had been practicing it, off and on, for 11 years. Every coastal authority watch commander in Aren's history had practiced it. I said, "This is Coastal Authority Watch Commander Severin Loth, operating under authority of the Aren Civil Compact and the Counternotice to Condemnation Order Reference 774-9. Filed originally 45,011 standard years ago and updated continuously through the current date. Aren is not a restricted zone. Aren is a functioning inhabited city with operational defensive infrastructure, registered under the counternotice as a continuously occupied human settlement. The orbital lattice targeting lock you are experiencing is standard automated protocol for unregistered transit entrance and will remain active in accordance with our operational standing orders. We are prepared to register your vessels in our transit registry and release the lock upon receipt of current identification credentials. Please provide them at your convenience." There was a silence on the channel that lasted for 1 minute and 43 seconds. Calder was watching her board. The rest of the watch floor had gone completely still. Through the observation rail's transparent face I could see the city, the early morning light picking out the tops of the tallest structures, the first of the coastal fog still lying in the lower streets, the distant line of the seawall running south, its weapon bays dark but their tracking indicators glowing a steady amber. The channel opened again. The voice this time was different, lower register, the specific cadence of a senior officer, someone who had spent a long time giving formal communications and had learned to keep the tension out of their voice. The voice said, "Watch Commander Loth, we are reviewing your counternotice filing. Please confirm you claim continuous occupation of the Aren zone for the full duration of the condemnation period." I said, "That is correct. We have maintained continuous occupation of the Aren zone for the full duration of the condemnation period. Our documentation of that occupation is available for your review. It comprises 11 volumes." Another silence. Then 11 volumes. I said, "Correct. The first volume begins 45,011 years ago with the counternotice filed by the surviving population following issuance of the condemnation order. Subsequent volumes document the continuous occupation in the forms required by Council Evidentiary Protocol as set out in the Galactic Enforcement Charter, Part 7, Section 14. We are prepared to transmit all 11 volumes in full at your request. And then, because I am a professional, and because I had been trained for this, and because the founders of Post-Condemnation Iran had spent 11 volumes making a legal argument that deserved to be made properly, I added. We would also note for the record that in accordance with Part 7, Section 14 of the Galactic Enforcement Charter, continuous documented occupation of a condemned zone for a period exceeding 10,000 standard years constitutes grounds for mandatory review and suspension of condemnation status, pending formal council hearing. We have now exceeded that threshold by 35,000 years. We filed our first formal review request 25,000 years ago. We have not received a response. We filed our second formal review request 15,000 years ago. We have not received a response. We filed our third formal review request 5,000 years ago. We have not received a response. Those filings are appended to Volume 8, Volume 9, and Volume 10 of the Registry, respectively, along with transmission records confirming their delivery to council relay stations. I paused because even in old protocol formal register, what I was about to say next deserved its own breath. I said, Volume 11 contains the current date and a complete account of this communication. The silence this time was longer, 4 minutes and 8 seconds. During those 4 minutes I watched Calder watching her board, and I watched the close assessment vessel, which had completed its second pass of the seawall and was now holding position south of the city, not ascending back to the formation and not descending further, just hanging there in the early morning atmosphere like a thought that someone was having difficulty finishing. The formation above us had gone quiet on all emissions except passive sensors. That was significant. An enforcement formation that has gone passive only is a formation whose command crew has, at minimum, decided to think before acting. I had hoped for exactly that. The doctrine had always hoped for exactly that. Because the difference between a council enforcement action and a council enforcement review is, in our particular situation, everything. And the difference between the two, in terms of what triggers which, comes down almost entirely to whether the command crew takes time to read what they are looking at before they start transmitting orders. They were reading what they were looking at. At 5:16, a third scan washed over a Wren different profile from the previous two, and Calder identified it before I asked. Deep infrastructure scan, she said. They're looking at the foundations. Of course they were. The surface pass had shown them the seawall's current state. The deep infrastructure scan would show them how deep the foundations ran. And the foundations of the 12th seawall were not the foundations of a 45-year-old construction project. They were the foundations of 45,000 years of continuous building, each iteration sited on the remnants and reinforcements of the last, going down in some sections 60 meters before reaching bedrock. The deep scan would show them strata of construction that read like geological layers, each one representing a generation of Iran's people who had inherited the seawall and chosen to add to it rather than let it decay. That was the point of the foundations, not just structural support, evidence. 45,000 years of evidence laid down in stone and steel, going down into the earth layer by layer the way a tree lays down rings, and every ring saying the same thing: we were here, and here, and here. I had a report on the deep scan results from our own monitoring systems within 3 minutes. The scan had reached bottom. They knew how deep it went. At the 4-minute mark, the lead vessel's formation-level communications officer, or whoever was speaking on behalf of the formation at that point, opened the channel again. The formal register was still there, but something in it had shifted. It was the shift you hear in a voice when the speaker has put down a set of assumptions and has not yet picked up a replacement. The voice said, "Watch Commander Loth. We require clarification on the infrastructure we have observed during our assessment pass. Our initial scan profile for this zone was prepared from the condemnation order data, which indicated an uninhabited surface with no significant construction. What we are observing is not consistent with that profile. Can you confirm the nature and extent of the construction infrastructure within the Aren zone? I said, I can. The seawall array is our primary coastal defense infrastructure. It was begun 11 years after the condemnation was issued and has been continuously expanded and rebuilt 12 times since. Its current iteration is 214 kilometers in length and carries full-spectrum weapons and sensor capability. The orbital lattice, which you are currently experiencing, is our atmospheric and near-orbital defense network. It was completed in its first iteration approximately 38,000 years ago and has been upgraded 17 times. The current iteration consists of 412 independently powered platform nodes in low and medium orbit. In addition to these primary systems, Aren operates coastal artillery at 18 points along its perimeter, a seabed monitoring network extending 200 kilometers offshore, and a population of approximately 9 million registered residents who are currently waking up and having their morning meals and going about their work. I let that sit for 3 seconds and then I said, additionally, we have 22 warships currently registered to the Aren Coastal Compact. 14 are in system. 8 are currently docked at our orbital platform. They are not armed ready at this time, but they can be brought to armed ready in approximately 40 minutes if the situation requires. I was not threatening them. I want to be precise about that. I was informing them. There is a difference, and the difference matters because we had not in 45,000 years ever made the first threat. We had built the infrastructure. We had kept the records. We had filed the paperwork. We had prepared the response templates and trained the watch commanders and maintained the registry through every generation since the founding survivor scratched her name on a steel plate and said she was still here. We had done all of that, but we had never fired on anyone who hadn't fired first, and we had never transmitted a threat, because the doctrine handed down from the founders, maintained through every revision of the Coastal Compact, was that the facts spoke for themselves, and our job was to make sure the facts were heard. The close assessment vessel during my last transmission had ascended back toward the formation. I watched it go on Calder's tracking feed, the steady amber of the lattice lock following it up, unwavering. There was another silence. This one felt different from the previous ones. The previous silences had felt like processing time. This one felt like recalibration, the specific quality of silence that belongs to a room where several people are reassessing a set of premises simultaneously, and none of them wants to be the first to say out loud that the premises were wrong. I thought about the command crew of the Sovereign Reach. I thought about what kind of briefing they would have received before this mission. A confirmation pass on a 45,000-year-old condemnation, the easiest assignment in the enforcement rotation, a formality, a box to check for the Council's administrative record. I thought about how they had filed their transit approach, loaded their scan profiles, and settled in for what should have been a routine documentation run. I thought about the moment the first scan came back, and the instrument started telling them something that didn't fit on the standard confirmation form. I felt for those people, something that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt. It was something more complicated. The feeling you get when you recognize that someone else's mistake is not a failure of intelligence but a failure of imagination, and that the failure of imagination belongs not to them personally, but to a system that had decided, 45,000 years ago, that the people in this city were not worth imagining. At 5:34, a new voice came on the channel. Senior command register but heavier, the weight of institutional authority, not just seniority. Council enforcement had a specific rank structure, and I had studied it in Volume 3, Chapter 6. The voice belonged to, or was performing the role of, a senior enforcement officer with full Council Commission authority. The voice said, "Watch Commander Loth. I am Enforcement Principal Sarath, commanding the Sovereign Reach Assessment Formation. I have reviewed your preliminary transmission and our assessment data. I want to be direct with you." I said, please. The voice said, the Condemnation Order 774-9 is a standing council instrument. Its terms have not been formally altered or suspended. Under that order, the structures and systems you describe, the seawall array, the orbital lattice, the warship registry, are constructed on and operating within a restricted zone, and their construction and operation occurred without council authorization. I need you to understand the legal position you are in. I said, I understand it perfectly. I would ask the enforcement principal to consult Part 7, Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Galactic Enforcement Charter, which specifies that a condemnation order issued against an inhabited zone without evacuation of the existing population is void at the moment of issuance if the affected population files a counter-notice within one standard generation. The founding survivors of post-condemnation, AREN, filed that counter-notice within 11 years of the condemnation order. The counter-notice voided the condemnation order at that moment. Everything built in AREN since then was built on land that was ours, under a condemnation order that was legally void, and I respectfully suggest that the enforcement action being contemplated is not an enforcement action against a restricted zone, but an attempted enforcement action against a legal human settlement with a 45,000-year documented history of occupation. A pause, then, you claim the counter-notice voided the order at issuance. I said I do. Paragraph 3 is not ambiguous. I have the text in Volume 3 if you would like it. Another pause, longer. Then, you said 11 volumes. I said yes. The enforcement principal was quiet for a moment. When the voice came back, it had changed again. The institutional weight was still there, but it was carrying something it had not been carrying before, something that, even through the precise formality of old protocol register, I recognized as the specific gravity of someone who is doing arithmetic and does not like the answer. The voice said, "How many names are in those 11 volumes?" I had been waiting for that question. Every watch commander who had ever run a registry event drill had been trained to wait for that question, because we had known, from the moment the founders started building the registry, that it would be the question that mattered. Not the infrastructure, not the legal arguments, not the weapons systems. The question that would matter in the end was the names. I said, the AREN Coastal Registry currently documents the names of every person born in or resident in AREN for the duration of the condemnation period. The current count, as of the most recent annual census, stands at approximately 472 million names. I said approximately because we add to it continuously. There have been 17 births in AREN since this conversation began. The silence that followed that statement was the longest silence yet, 7 minutes and 40 seconds. I know the exact duration because Calder logged it on her board, and because I stood at the rail for every second of it and looked at the city below me and thought about 472 million names. Thought about the first one, the founding survivor, 45,000 years ago, scratching her name on a steel plate. Thought about all the names between that first one and the 17 that had been added this morning. Thought about the doctrine, let them look first, let them read the sky, let them do the arithmetic. The enforcement principal had done the arithmetic. At 5:41, the channel opened again. The formal register was intact, but it was carrying a quality I had not heard in it before and had not expected to hear. I had expected cold disagreement. I had expected procedural resistance. I had been prepared for a very long argument conducted with great legal precision in old protocol formal register. An argument that we would win because we had been preparing for it for 45,000 years. I had not expected what I heard, which was something closer to wait. Not defeat. This was not the voice of someone conceding a fight. It was the voice of someone who had just absorbed something and had not yet found a frame large enough to put it in. The voice said, "Watch Commander Loth." The Sovereign Reach Assessment Formation will hold current position and await further instruction from Council Administrative Review. I am initiating an emergency administrative stay on the Condemnation Order 774-9 effective from this communication, pending formal Council review and the submission of your documentation. I said, we will transmit all 11 volumes to your secure registry channel on your request. The voice said, yes, please transmit them. And then, and this was the part I had not expected, had not trained for, had not found a prepared template for in any of the 22,000 years of preparation documents in the registry. The voice said, quietly, still in formal register, but carrying something underneath it that was not formal at all. How long did you know we were coming? I considered the question. I considered it for 6 seconds, which is a long time on an open channel. I said we knew the kind of thing that was coming. We did not know when, so we built the seawall, we kept the registry, we trained the watch commanders, we prepared the response templates, we filed the paperwork 3 times and kept the transmission records, we grew the city, we had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we gave them all names and put the names in the book, because the book was the point. The book was always the point. I paused, and then because it needed to be said, because it was in the founding document, because the founding survivor had said it first and 45,000 years of Arin had kept on saying it, I said, we did not build the seawall to scare you. We built it because the founders decided that the best way to honor the names in the registry was to make sure no one ever had reason to doubt that those names belonged to people who had chosen to stay. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then the enforcement principal said, I will need time to review the legal position. I said, take the time you need. We are not going anywhere. That was not a threat either. It was a statement of fact. It was, in some ways, the original statement of fact, the one the founding survivor had made 45,000 years ago when she scratched her name on a plate and told the record she was still here. At 5:47, my deputy forwarded a communication from the captain of the warship Arin Founder, which was among the 8 vessels currently docked at our orbital platform. The captain's name was Hess, and she had been watching the morning's event on the platform's tactical feed. Her communication was brief. It said, Coastal Watch Founder standing by. 14 warships in system. We are ready if you need us. We have been ready. That last sentence, we have been ready, was not a dramatic addition. It was standard sign-off language in the Arin Coastal Compact Military Registry. Every vessel check-in used it. It had been the standard sign-off language since the first Arin warship had been commissioned, 38,000 years ago, under a compact provision that specified that any vessel carrying the Arin registry would affirm readiness at every communication as a matter of standing doctrine. I sent back, stand by, Founder. Situation under legal review. No action required at this time. Hess sent back, understood, standing by. 14 warships standing by. 412 lattice nodes with targeting solutions already computed and held. 214 kilometers of seawall on monitoring amber. 9 million people going about their morning. We had been ready for a long time. At 6:11, the Sovereign Reach Formation transmitted a formal request for the registry files, all 11 volumes. Calder opened the secure channel and initiated the transfer. 472 million names and the records around them, moving from our servers to theirs in a steady encrypted stream. The transfer rate was high. We had anticipated the transmission and over-provisioned the channel bandwidth 18 months ago, during the last annual infrastructure review, because the annual infrastructure review for the past 40,000 years had included, among its standard items, a line that read, ensure transmission capacity sufficient for full registry transfer on 0 notice. It took 3 hours and 14 minutes to complete the transfer. During those 3 hours, the formation held position above Arin, and I stayed at the observation rail for the first hour, and then turned the watch over to my deputy for the second and third hours and went down to the records room. At 6:18, the civil alert pushed to every device in Iran. The notification said what it had always said: Registry event active. Coastal Authority has jurisdiction. Iran remembers. I watched the notification propagate across the city on Calder's social sensor display before I left the floor. A wave of light, in effect, spreading outward from the city center as 9 million people woke up and read it, and in the particular way that people who have grown up in Iran absorb this information, went about their morning with a kind of settled, grounded calm. There were no panicked crowds. There were no runs on shelters. There were people standing in their doorways looking up at the sky, and I understand from the reports that came in through the morning that some of them were pointing out the formation to their children and grandchildren, showing them the shapes against the early light and saying quietly that this was what all of it had been for: the seawall, the registry, the names. I went down 3 levels to the records room. Volume 1 of the registry is kept there, not the original, which is in the memorial installation at the northern terminus of the seawall, but a working copy maintained for reference use by the Watch Command. I opened it to the first page, the Founding Survivors Counter Notice. The original text, in the handwriting of a woman who had just watched her city be written off, and had decided that the correct response to being written off was to start a filing system. The text is not long. It is 1 page. It says, in the language of 45,000 years ago, that the people of this city do not accept the condemnation order, that they are still here, that they intend to remain here, that they will document their presence continuously and in accordance with the evidentiary requirements of the Galactic Enforcement Charter until such time as the Council acknowledges that the condemnation order was void at issuance. That they would like the Council to know that they are keeping track of every day, and every name, and every generation. And that they will be ready when the Council finally comes back. She wrote that 45,000 years ago. She could not have known it would be 45,000 years. She might have imagined 10,000 or 20,000, or she might have been writing for an audience she expected to arrive in her own lifetime, writing in the patient certainty that she would be ready, and that readiness was the only answer that mattered. I read the first page twice. I had read it many times before, enough times that I could recite it, but there is something different about reading it on the morning of a registry event, when the people she was writing to are actually present, 11 kilometers above the coast, having their assumptions revised by 45 millennia of accumulated documentation. It reads differently on that morning. The patience in it reads differently. The clarity reads differently. She knew the argument was right. She knew because she had read the charter, because she had found Part 7, Section 14, because she had worked out the legal mathematics of continuous occupation and counternotice and review rights before she wrote a single word of the counternotice itself. She had done the research first, then she had filed. That order: research, then file. Understand the ground you are standing on before you stake your claim, was the founding instruction of the registry, and every watch commander trained since had been told it on their first day. Know the law before you use it. She had known it. We all knew it. I sat with Volume 1 for nearly 40 minutes. I read the first page, then I read the second page, which contained the names of the first 23 people the founding survivor had recorded in the registry, the people who had been in the city with her in the first weeks after the condemnation, the ones who had survived the initial enforcement sweep and chosen to stay rather than scatter. 23 names. Some of them had annotations beside them: their trade, their approximate age, their stated intention to remain. The founding survivor had apparently gone around and asked each person individually whether they consented to be in the registry and had written down their answer. Every answer was yes. Some of the answers had additional notes. One said, "I was born here." One said, "My mother is buried here." One said, "Where else would I go?" One said, in a phrasing I have always found remarkable in its economy, "I am not done here." 23 people who were not done with a city that the Galactic Enforcement Council had decided was finished. 472 million names later, here we were. I closed the volume carefully and left it exactly as I had found it, squared on the reading table with its spine, aligned to the table, edged the way the Records Room Protocol specified. Records Room Protocol had been written 40,000 years ago and amended 37 times. The instruction about aligning volumes to the table edge had been in every version. Whoever had written the original protocol had understood something important. The care you show a document is an argument about how seriously you take what the document says. The founding survivor had written something that deserved to be treated with care. Every generation of a Wren had treated it that way. I sent back a confirmation and a suggested time and went to get something to eat, because it was nearly 10 in the morning and I had been at the rail since before midnight and even on registry event mornings. The work continues. The communication with the enforcement principal ran for 2 hours in the afternoon. It was conducted, on both sides, in old protocol formal register. It was measured and precise and legalistic, and at several points very detailed about the specific provisions of Part 7, Section 14 of the Galactic Enforcement Charter, about which I can now say with some confidence that I have a better command than most of the enforcement officers I am likely to speak with, given that I have been studying it for 11 years, and the archive team that supports the Coastal Authority has been studying it for considerably longer. The outcome of the communication was a mutual agreement. The Sovereign Reach Formation would transmit a formal notification to Council Administrative Center requesting a hearing on the condemnation order review. The administrative stay, initiated by Enforcement Principal Sarath, would remain in effect pending that hearing. A Wren would transmit the full registry documentation to the Council Administrative Office. We would also transmit our 3 unanswered review requests with the transmission records, because we had been waiting 25,000 years for someone to respond to those, and it seemed appropriate to make sure they were on the table. The enforcement principal asked, at one point in that communication, how we had known about Part 7, Section 14. I told him it was in Volume 3. He asked what else was in Volume 3. I told him Volume 3 contained the full text of the Galactic Enforcement Charter, a grammar and vocabulary index for old protocol formal register, the operational protocols for Council enforcement assessment missions, including the Close Assessment Pass Doctrine, and the disassembly report for an enforcement courier that had drifted into our boundary zone 11,000 years ago and been recovered. There was a pause. Then the enforcement principal said, in a tone that was still formal register but contained something that I recognized, across the gap of 45,000 years and 2 completely different civilizational backgrounds, as something fairly close to rueful, you recovered one of our couriers. I said we did. We were very thorough with it. The data cores are archived in Volume 3, Appendix 7. We will include them in the transmission. Another pause, then I see. I said, we have been preparing for this conversation for a long time. We wanted to be ready. The enforcement principal said, and I will note that this was not informal register. This was something closer to a private register, the tone of a person speaking past the protocol to the person on the other end of the line. I am beginning to understand that. He asked me, toward the end of the communication, about the memorial at the northern terminus of the seawall. He asked what the inscription said. I told him verbatim. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that his close assessment vessel's visual sensors had logged the inscription during the pass. I said I know. He said they had not expected to find an inscription. I said I imagine not. He said the woman who wrote it, the original counter-notice, do you know anything about her? I said we know what she left us. The counter-notice, written in her own hand. The founding entries in Volume 1, the names of the people who were with her in the city in those first years. The engineering notes from the first seawall construction project which she apparently supervised. She did not leave a biography. She left the work. The enforcement principal said. She left 45,000 years of it. I said she left the beginning of it. The rest was everyone who came after. There was a silence that I did not break because it did not need to be broken. It was the particular silence of two people standing, however remotely, in the same understanding, which was that a woman 45,000 years ago had looked at what was being done to her city, and had responded not with anger that burned out and not with grief that turned inward, but with something harder and more lasting, the decision to make herself impossible to ignore, not through force, not through spectacle, through patience, through documentation, through the absolute refusal to stop counting. 472 million names. She had begun the counting. Everyone else had kept it going. At 9:47 of that morning, the transfer had completed, and at 10:30 the formal communication had been confirmed, and by 1800 hours the Sovereign Reach formation was filing its transit toward high orbit. I was back at the observation rail by then. The second watch had done their shift and I had come back up, as I sometimes do in the evenings, because the view from the rail is good and the early evening light on the coast is something I have never stopped finding worth seeing. I watched the formation on Calder's board. She had stayed on for the evening watch voluntarily, which I noted and would commend in her file. As the vessels rose through the lower atmosphere past the orbital lattice nodes, the amber targeting indicators followed them up, as procedure required, until they were above the registered operational threshold. They held position in high orbit for approximately 20 minutes, which I understand from later context was the time required for the enforcement principal to complete his initial administrative filing. And then they folded out, and the big board went quiet, and the lattice stood down to standard monitoring posture, and the watch floor exhaled. Calder, who had been on duty for 14 hours by that point and looked it, turned in her chair and looked at me. She said, "That's it." I said, "For today." She said, "We're going to get a hearing." I said, "Yes. We have been waiting 25,000 years for it. We will survive the wait." She looked at her board for a moment, and then she said, "Do you think they'll rule in our favor?" I thought about the founding survivors' counter notice. I thought about 11 volumes of names. I thought about 472 million human beings, and the 214 kilometers of seawall that had been built in their name, and the 45,000 years of paperwork that had been filed on their behalf by every generation of watch commanders and archivists and civil compact administrators and ordinary people living their ordinary lives in a city that had been told it was a dead zone and had quietly, methodically, refused to be won. I thought about what Part 7, Section 14, Paragraph 3 says. I said, I think the law says what it says, and I think we have the documentation to prove what it says applies to us, and I think the enforcement principal knows it. Calder nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She wrote it on a steel plate." I said, "Yes." She said, 45,000 years ago. I said, 45,011. She wrote it 11 years after they condemned us. She wrote it because she knew the argument was right and she intended to make it, and she figured it needed to be in writing. Calder was quiet again. Then she said, "I want to see the original when this is over. Can I see the original?" I said, "Go to the northern terminus of the seawall. Go to the memorial installation. There's a room inside with a climate chamber. The volumes are in there. Volume 1 is at the front." She nodded. We went back to work. There was a full watch report to file, 17 addenda to submit to the registry update team, a legal brief to coordinate with the Compact's law office, and a communication to prepare for the morning briefing at the civil authority level. Aren had been awake since before dawn. The city's evening was coming in now, the coastal light going amber and long, the fog beginning to gather again in the lower streets, the seawall sensor indicators dropping back to their standard monitoring amber. 9 million people going about their evenings, children being put to bed. names being added to the registry before the day was fully logged and closed. The hearing would come. It would take time. Council administrative process was not fast, and we were not in a hurry and never had been. We had been in the registry for 45,000 years. We could wait for a hearing. We had always been better at waiting than they expected. The founding survivor had known that too. She had not known how long the wait would be, but she had understood the shape of it, had understood that the thing that would matter in the end was not the anger or the grief or the scale of what had been done to this city, but the patience, the discipline of keeping the record, the clarity of knowing that the argument was right and that the right argument, made continuously and documented completely over a long enough span of time, would eventually have to be heard. She had begun the registry in the hope that one day someone would come back and read it. That hope had been patient and specific and grounded in the law. Today someone came back. They read it. We are still here.